82 years ago, during the Battle of Tarawa in 1942, Lieutenant Commander Samuel Harrison and the crew of USS Harder disappeared without leaving traces. Their absence plunged 79 American families into tragedy and silent mourning. While the naval community and fellow sailors remained confused by the mystery, military archives suggested hypotheses, but no conclusion was reached. The case fell into official oblivion, but the families never lost hope, fighting for the truth to emerge. The morning of November 15, 1942, dawned grey and ominous over the Pacific waters surrounding Tarawa Atoll. The USS Harder, a Gato-class submarine, had been patrolling these treacherous waters for 3 weeks, part of the critical intelligence-gathering operations that would later support the massive amphibious assault on the heavily fortified Japanese positions. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Harrison, a 34-year-old career naval officer from Ohio, had earned his crew's respect through 2 previous successful patrols. His wife, Margaret, waited anxiously back in Pearl Harbor, where she worked as a nurse treating wounded sailors returning from the front lines. Their 8-year-old son, Tommy, attended the base school, proudly telling classmates about his father's heroic missions beneath the waves. The Harder's final transmission came at 6:47 hours, a routine position report confirming their location approximately 12 miles northeast of Betio Island. Radioman First Class Robert Chen had sent the coded message with his characteristic precision, unaware it would be the last communication the outside world would receive from the 79 souls aboard the submarine. According to the patrol schedule, Harrison was conducting a reconnaissance mission, gathering intelligence on Japanese shipping lanes and defensive positions. The submarine had successfully completed similar operations throughout the Solomon Islands campaign, earning commendations for their stealth and accuracy. But the waters around Tarawa held dangers that even experienced submariners couldn't anticipate. At 0800 hours, the USS Harder was scheduled to surface for a brief communication window with Fleet Command. The radio operators at Pearl Harbor waited, their headsets crackling with static. Minutes passed, then hours. By 1200 hours, concern had transformed into alarm. By 1800 hours, it had become terror. Margaret Harrison received the devastating news at 2100 hours that same day. A Navy chaplain, accompanied by her husband's commanding officer, knocked on the door of their base housing. The words they spoke seemed to echo from a great distance. Missing in action. Search operations underway. Still hope for recovery. But hope, Margaret would learn, was sometimes the cruelest gift the military could offer. As days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months, the official search efforts gradually diminished. Other battles demanded attention, other ships required protection, and the vast Pacific began to swallow not just the Harder, but the memory of the men who had served aboard her. The families left behind, wives like Margaret, children like Tommy, parents who had sacrificed their sons to the war effort, found themselves trapped in a limbo more torturous than definitive news of death. Without bodies to bury or wreckage to mourn, they existed in a perpetual state of anticipation, forever listening for footsteps that would never come, forever watching horizons that would never reveal their loved ones' return. By Christmas 1942, the USS Harder had been officially classified as overdue and presumed lost. The Navy's final report, a document that would remain classified for decades, offered only speculation about possible causes: enemy action, mechanical failure, or navigational error in treacherous waters. The official silence surrounding the USS Harder's disappearance created wounds that refused to heal in the hearts of 79 American families. While the nation celebrated victories in the Pacific theater, these families remained imprisoned by questions that military bureaucracy seemed unwilling or unable to answer. Margaret Harrison embodied the anguish of military spouses who had sacrificed everything for a war that gave them nothing in return. Day after day, she continued her nursing duties at Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital, tending to wounded sailors who returned when her husband could not. Her colleagues whispered about her dedication, unaware that work was the only thing preventing her complete collapse into despair. Young Tommy Harrison struggled to understand why his father's submarine had simply vanished. At school, other children spoke proudly of their father's confirmed heroic deaths in famous battles: Guadalcanal, Midway, the Coral Sea. But Tommy had no such closure to offer when classmates asked about his father. The boy began telling elaborate stories about secret missions and underwater adventures, creating the heroic narrative that official channels had failed to provide. In Iowa, Robert Chen's elderly parents, immigrants who had pinned their American dreams on their son's naval service, waited by their farmhouse radio each evening, hoping for news that never came. Chen's mother, Li Wei, maintained his bedroom exactly as he had left it, changing the sheets weekly and dusting his high school baseball trophies. His father, Chen Wei-ming, wrote letter after letter to Navy officials, his broken English pleading for any information about his son's fate. The Murphy family in Boston faced particular cruelty. Machinist's mate First Class Patrick Murphy had been scheduled to marry his childhood sweetheart, Catherine O'Brien, during his next shore leave. Catherine kept the wedding dress hanging in her closet for 3 years, unable to accept that the ceremony would never take place. She aged rapidly during those years, her auburn hair turning grey as she maintained vigil for a man who would never return to claim her as his bride. Military chaplains tasked with providing comfort to these devastated families found themselves ill-equipped to address the unique torment of ambiguous loss. How do you counsel a mother who doesn't know whether to mourn her son or maintain hope for his return? How do you guide a child who asks nightly when Daddy will come home from his underwater mission? The Navy's official position, while bureaucratically necessary, proved emotionally devastating. Without physical evidence of the submarine's destruction, the crew could not be declared legally dead. This bureaucratic limbo prevented families from accessing death benefits, collecting insurance policies, or even holding proper memorial services. They existed in a twilight world of administrative suspension, too alive to die, too missing to live. Lieutenant Commander Harrison's personnel file, like those of his crew, remained officially active. His pay continued to accrue in an account that Margaret couldn't access. Military housing policies meant she could remain on base as long as her husband was listed as missing rather than deceased, but the psychological cost of that technicality proved almost unbearable. Local communities tried to provide support, but well-meaning neighbors often delivered more pain than comfort. Phrases like "he'll turn up" or "you have to stay strong" revealed fundamental misunderstandings of the specific trauma these families endured. Unlike widows who could grieve and eventually rebuild their lives, the Harder families remained forever suspended in the first stage of loss, unable to progress through the natural healing process. The military's institutional amnesia proved particularly cruel. As new tragedies demanded attention and fresh heroes captured public imagination, the story of USS Harder began fading from official memory. Annual remembrance ceremonies focused on confirmed casualties and documented battles, leaving little space for mysteries that remained unresolved. By 1945, as victory celebrations erupted across America, the families of the Harder found themselves increasingly isolated. Their private war continued long after the public conflict had ended, their personal battles fought in silence while the nation moved forward into peacetime prosperity. Margaret Harrison began keeping a detailed diary, recording not just her daily struggles, but also every rumor, every unofficial theory, and every fleeting hope about her husband's fate. These pages would become both her salvation and her torment, preserving the memory of a man who was slowly disappearing from everyone else's consciousness. As months transformed into years, the mystery of USS Harder's disappearance spawned numerous theories, each more haunting than the last. Naval investigators, amateur historians, and the families themselves developed explanations that ranged from mechanical failure to enemy action, but none could be proven without the submarine's physical remains. The most widely accepted theory within Navy circles suggested that the Harder had fallen victim to Japanese depth charges during a coordinated anti-submarine operation. Intelligence reports from the period indicated increased Japanese patrol activity around Tarawa, with several enemy destroyers conducting systematic sweeps of the area where the submarine had last been reported. Commander William Burke, who served as the Navy's liaison with the families, privately believed this explanation made the most sense. Japanese forces had demonstrated sophisticated anti-submarine tactics throughout 1942, using coordinated attacks with destroyers and aircraft to trap American submarines in shallow waters. The coral reefs around Tarawa created perfect conditions for such an ambush, limiting a submarine's maneuvering options while providing clear sonar signatures for enemy forces. However, A more disturbing theory began circulating among the submarine service's intelligence officers. Several reports suggested that Japanese forces had captured advanced sonar equipment from damaged American vessels, potentially allowing them to detect submarines at much greater distances than previously thought possible. If true, this would mean the Harder had sailed into waters where the enemy held a decisive technological advantage. Margaret Harrison found herself obsessing over a different possibility entirely. Her husband had mentioned in his last letter home that one of his crew members had been acting strangely, asking unusual questions about patrol routes and communication schedules. Samuel hadn't elaborated, but Margaret wondered whether the submarine had been betrayed from within, its position revealed to enemy forces by a saboteur or spy among the crew. This theory gained disturbing credibility when Navy investigators discovered that Yeoman Second Class David Kowalski, who had joined the Harder's crew just weeks before their final mission, had provided false information on his enlistment papers. Kowalski's background check revealed connections to German-American organizations that the FBI had been monitoring for potential espionage activities. However, without the submarine itself, investigators could neither prove nor disprove whether internal sabotage had played a role in the disaster. The family's support group, which had formed informally among the Harder widows and parents, developed their own theories based on careful analysis of their loved ones' final letters. Several crew members had mentioned unusual mechanical problems in their correspondence, particularly with the submarine's diving plane controls and ballast tank systems. These reports suggested the possibility of catastrophic mechanical failure that could have sent the submarine to crush depth before the crew could react. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. Robert Chen's father, drawing on his engineering background, proposed a different explanation. His analysis of Pacific currents and weather patterns during November 1942 suggested that the submarine might have been caught in an underwater landslide triggered by seismic activity. The region around Tarawa was known for geological instability, and several small earthquakes had been recorded during the time frame of the Harder's disappearance. Military analysts also considered the possibility of navigational error leading to disaster. The waters around Tarawa contained numerous uncharted obstacles, including coral formations that could easily puncture a submarine's hull. If the Harder had deviated from its planned course, either due to equipment malfunction or human error, it could have collided with underwater obstacles in an area where no rescue operations would have been possible. Perhaps the most heartbreaking theory came from Tommy Harrison himself, now 10 years old and desperately trying to make sense of his father's absence. The boy had convinced himself that his father and crew were stranded on a deserted island somewhere in the Pacific, unable to signal for help, but still alive and waiting for rescue. Tommy spent hours studying maps of the Pacific, marking potential locations where the submarine might have surfaced and the crew might have established a survival camp. The Navy's official position remained frustratingly vague. Without physical evidence, they could neither confirm destruction nor declare the crew dead. This bureaucratic limbo served administrative purposes but provided no emotional resolution for the families who needed answers to begin healing from their loss. As the war continued, new submarine losses provided fresh tragedies that demanded attention and resources. The search for USS Harder, never particularly intensive due to wartime priorities, gradually ceased altogether. The submarine and its crew joined the growing list of military mysteries that would remain unsolved until technology and time could reveal their secrets. By 1944, most Navy personnel had stopped discussing the Harder case entirely. The submarine had become a ghost story whispered among submariners, a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking beneath the Pacific's deceptively calm surface. But for 79 families, the mystery remained as immediate and painful as ever, a wound that refused to heal without the truth. The years following 1942 revealed the devastating human cost of uncertainty as the families of USS Harder's crew struggled to rebuild lives that remained forever incomplete. Without closure, without bodies to bury, without final confirmation of their loved one's fate, these families became prisoners of their own hope and despair. Margaret Harrison's transformation from hopeful Navy wife to exhausted caregiver illustrated the psychological toll of ambiguous loss. By 1945, she had developed what military doctors would later recognize as a form of chronic traumatic stress, though such diagnoses were rarely acknowledged for military families during that era. She continued working at Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital, but colleagues noticed her increasing detachment from patients and procedures. Her son Tommy, now 13, had constructed an elaborate fantasy world where his father remained alive on a secret underwater base, conducting classified missions that required absolute communication silence. When other children outgrew such imaginative play, Tommy's fantasies became more detailed and consuming. School counselors noted his inability to form lasting friendships, his academic performance declining as he spent more time drawing submarines and underwater cities than completing assignments. The breaking point came during Christmas 1946, when Tommy announced to his mother that he had received a telepathic message from his father, confirming that the crew was safe and would return soon. Margaret realized that her son's coping mechanism had transformed into something more concerning, but military mental health resources remained virtually non-existent for dependents dealing with unresolved losses. In Boston, Catherine O'Brien's story embodied the particular cruelty faced by fiancés and girlfriends who lacked the official recognition accorded to wives. Without legal status as Patrick Murphy's spouse, she received no military death benefits, no survivor support, and no official acknowledgement of her loss. Her family, well-meaning but increasingly impatient, pressured her to accept other suitors and move forward with her life. Catherine's refusal to abandon hope for Patrick's return created rifts in her relationships that would never fully heal. By 1948, she had become known in her neighborhood as the woman who wouldn't let go, a cautionary tale whispered among young couples about the dangers of loving someone in wartime. She took work as a seamstress, her fingers growing arthritic from countless hours of detailed needlework that provided the only distraction from her consuming grief. The Chen family faced additional challenges, rooted in the anti-Asian sentiment that persisted even as Chinese forces fought alongside American troops in the Pacific Theater. Robert Chen's parents, already struggling with language barriers and cultural isolation, found their grief complicated by suspicion, from neighbors who questioned their loyalty and wondered whether their son might have been involved in sabotage. Li Wei Chen began visiting the local Catholic church daily, despite her Buddhist upbringing, desperately seeking any spiritual framework that might provide answers about her son's fate. She learned English prayers and American hymns, hoping that adopting her son's chosen culture might somehow bring him home. Her husband, Chen Wei-ming, sold their small farm and used the proceeds to hire private investigators who promised to search military records for any trace of information about the submarine's disappearance. The Murphy family's working-class Irish Catholic background provided a strong community support system, but even that network began to fray under the weight of prolonged uncertainty. Patrick's younger brothers, eager to honor his memory by enlisting themselves, found their plans complicated by their parents' desperate need for them to remain safe at home. The family dynamic shifted as the absent Patrick paradoxically became more influential in family decisions than the living sons who remained. Mrs. Murphy developed a ritual of setting an extra place at dinner every evening, maintaining Patrick's bedroom exactly as he had left it, and refusing to discuss any topic that acknowledged the possibility of his death. Her husband, a construction foreman, accustomed to solving problems through direct action, found himself helpless against an enemy he couldn't identify or confront. His frustration manifested as increased drinking and explosive anger at military bureaucrats who offered sympathy but no answers. As the 1940s progressed, the informal support network among harder families began to fragment. Some families chose to pursue legal declaration of death to access benefits and achieve some form of closure. Others, like the Harrisons, remained committed to maintaining hope regardless of the personal cost. These different approaches created tension and judgment within a group that had once provided mutual comfort. The broader American society's relationship with these unresolved losses proved equally complicated. The nation's narrative of World War II focused on clear victories and heroic sacrifices, leaving little space for mysteries and ambiguous endings. Families dealing with unresolved military losses often felt pressured to either fabricate closure or remain silent about their ongoing suffering. Military policies regarding missing personnel reflected institutional discomfort with uncertainty. The Navy's emphasis on precise record-keeping and clear classifications struggled to accommodate situations where evidence remained incomplete. This bureaucratic rigidity, while administratively necessary, often exacerbated the emotional trauma experienced by families who needed acknowledgement of their unique form of loss. By 1950, 8 years after the disappearance, most USS Harder family members had been forced to make practical decisions that contradicted their emotional needs. Margaret Harrison finally accepted legal declaration of her husband's death to secure educational benefits for Tommy and survivor's pension for herself. The paperwork that officially ended Samuel Harrison's military service felt like a betrayal of the hope she had maintained for nearly a decade. The 1950s brought a new challenge for the Harder families, a society determined to move beyond wartime trauma and embrace post-war prosperity. As America focused on suburban growth and economic expansion, families still wrestling with unresolved losses from the previous decade found themselves increasingly isolated and misunderstood. Margaret Harrison's decision to leave Pearl Harbor and return to the mainland represented both an escape from constant reminders of her husband's service and an acknowledgement that her old life was truly over. She and Tommy settled in San Diego, where she found work as a civilian nurse and he began high school. The change of environment was meant to provide a fresh start, but both mother and son discovered that geography couldn't heal wounds that remained internal and persistent. Tommy's transition to civilian high school proved particularly difficult. His years of military base education had provided structure and understanding of his father's absence, but civilian classmates couldn't relate to his experience of growing up with an ongoing mystery rather than a resolved tragedy. His detailed knowledge of submarines and Pacific theater operations, once a source of pride, now marked him as oddly obsessed with subjects his peers found boring or disturbing. The teenager began seeking out older veterans who had served in the Pacific, hoping to find someone who might have encountered his father or heard rumors about the Harder's fate. These conversations, while providing temporary comfort, often reinforced his inability to accept his father's permanent absence. Several veterans, recognizing the boy's desperation, invented elaborate stories about secret missions and classified operations, inadvertently feeding Tommy's fantasy that his father remained alive somewhere in the Pacific. In Iowa, the Chen family's attempts to integrate into their small farming community continued to face obstacles rooted in both racial prejudice and the community's discomfort with their unresolved grief. Chen Wei-ming's letters to military officials had evolved from desperate pleas for information into angry demands for accountability, but his broken English and immigrant status meant his concerns received minimal attention from bureaucrats dealing with thousands of similar inquiries. Li Wei-chen's daily prayers had become a neighborhood curiosity as she maintained a shrine to her son that combined Buddhist traditions with American military honors. Local church ladies attempting to show Christian charity regularly invited her to abandon what they viewed as pagan practices in favor of proper American mourning rituals. Their well-intentioned advice only deepened her sense of cultural isolation and spiritual confusion. The Chen family's financial situation deteriorated steadily throughout the decade. The money spent on private investigators and lawyers had exhausted their savings, while Chen Wei-ming's age and limited English prevented him from finding steady employment. By 1955, they were forced to sell their remaining property and move to a cramped apartment in Des Moines, where Li Wei took work in a commercial laundry to support her increasingly frail husband. Catherine O'Brien's story during this period illustrated the particular challenges faced by unmarried women, whose lives had been permanently altered by wartime losses. As her friends married and started families, Catherine remained frozen in 1942, unable to move forward without definitive knowledge of Patrick Murphy's fate. Her refusal to consider other relationships became a source of family conflict and community gossip. By 1952, Catherine's mother had begun actively arranging introductions with suitable men, arguing that 10 years of waiting was sufficient demonstration of loyalty to Patrick's memory. These forced social situations became increasingly awkward as Catherine's inability to engage emotionally became obvious to well-meaning suitors. Her reputation as a woman damaged by war made her an object of pity rather than romantic interest, further compounding her isolation. The Murphy family's response to their prolonged uncertainty reflected broader Irish Catholic approaches to suffering and faith. Patrick's mother maintained her daily rituals of hope, viewing any suggestion of acceptance as a betrayal of both her son and her religious beliefs. The family's priest, Father McKenna, struggled to provide spiritual guidance that acknowledged both the reality of probable loss and the importance of maintaining faith in divine providence. Patrick's younger brothers had developed dramatically different responses to their missing sibling. Michael, the eldest, had enlisted in the Navy immediately upon turning 18, determined to follow his brother's path and perhaps discover information about the Harder's fate. His military service, while honorable, became consumed by unofficial investigations into submarine operations and missing vessel reports that interfered with his duties and concerned his commanding officers. James, the youngest Murphy brother, chose the opposite path, rejecting any connection to military service and becoming increasingly involved in labor organizing and anti-war activism. His political development was directly influenced by his family's treatment by military bureaucracy, and he used their experience as evidence of institutional callousness toward working-class families. The brothers' divergent responses created additional family tension during an already difficult period. The broader submarine service community during the 1950s began acknowledging the psychological impact of extended uncertainty on families of missing crews. The development of more sophisticated search and recovery techniques for subsequent submarine accidents highlighted the inadequacy of 1940s investigation methods, but provided little comfort to families whose losses predated these improvements. Several submarine commanders who had served during the war period began informal efforts to document and investigate unresolved disappearances, including the USS Harder case. These efforts, conducted without official sanction, relied on veterans' memories and unofficial records that military archivists had overlooked or misclassified. While their work provided emotional support for affected families, it rarely produced concrete evidence about specific vessels' fates. The decade's end brought some families to acceptance of permanent uncertainty, while others remained committed to active searching. These different responses created divisions within the informal Harder family network that had provided crucial support during the immediate post-war years. Some families viewed acceptance as a healthy form of healing, while others perceived it as abandonment of their missing loved ones. The 1960s and 1970s brought generational change to the families still haunted by the USS Harder mystery, as parents aged and children born after the war struggled to understand their families' ongoing connection to events they had never experienced. The passage of time, rather than healing wounds, seemed to deepen the divide between those who remembered and those who inherited the consequences of unresolved loss. If this case has already captured your attention, hit the like button. It helps Lieutenant Commander Samuel Harrison and his crew's story reach more people. Tommy Harrison, now in his 30s and a father himself, found his own children asking questions about their missing grandfather that he still couldn't answer satisfactorily. His wife, Janet, had married into a family mystery that continued to influence daily decisions and emotional dynamics despite occurring decades before her birth. Tommy's insistence on naming their first son Samuel created the first serious conflict in their marriage, as Janet worried about passing trauma to another generation. Tommy's career as a marine biology researcher had been directly influenced by his childhood obsession with his father's underwater fate. His scientific work on deep-sea recovery techniques was motivated by more than academic curiosity, though he rarely admitted this connection to colleagues. His research into Pacific Ocean currents and geological formations reflected a continuing, albeit more sophisticated, search for explanations about the submarine's disappearance. Margaret Harrison, now approaching 60, had developed a carefully maintained public composure that concealed her private continuation of the search for answers. Her retirement from nursing provided time for extensive correspondence with military historians, submarine veterans, and amateur researchers who maintained interest in unresolved wartime mysteries. Her basement contained filing cabinets full of letters, maps, and theories that represented 30 years of methodical investigation. The advent of Vietnam War protests during the late 1960s created unexpected resonance with the Harder family's experiences. Young activists questioning military authority and demanding accountability for missing service members found common ground with older families still seeking answers about World War II disappearances. Margaret Harrison began attending anti-war demonstrations not as a political statement, but as a way to connect with others who understood the cost of military secrecy and institutional indifference. In Des Moines, Li Wei-chen had outlived her husband by nearly a decade, maintaining her son's shrine while working in the commercial laundry well into her 70s. Her limited English had never improved significantly, but she had developed relationships with other immigrant mothers who had lost children to American military service. This informal support network provided cultural understanding that mainstream American grief counseling couldn't offer. Chen Wei-ming's death in 1963 had been hastened by 2 decades of stress and disappointment, according to the Chinese community's gossip network. Li Wei's ritual burning of his papers had revealed the extent of his obsession with finding Robert's fate, including detailed maps of Pacific battle sites and correspondence with submarine veterans across the country. His final years had been consumed by increasingly desperate theories about prisoner-of-war camps and secret military installations. Catherine O'Brien's story during this period reflected the broader social changes affecting unmarried women in American society. The feminist movement of the late 1960s provided new frameworks for understanding her choice to remain single, though Catherine's motivations remained rooted in unresolved grief rather than political consciousness. Her work as a seamstress had evolved into a small business, providing economic independence that allowed her to maintain her vigil without family pressure. The social acceptance of extended singlehood during the 1970s gave Catherine permission to stop pretending that her choice was temporary. She began openly acknowledging that she was waiting for a man who would probably never return, a decision that younger feminists celebrated as authentic self-determination, while older family members viewed as psychological pathology. Her story became part of local folklore about women whose lives had been permanently altered by war. The Murphy family's evolution during these decades illustrated how unresolved military losses affected multiple generations. Patrick's parents had died within 2 years of each other in the late 1950s, their prolonged grief having exhausted their physical and emotional reserves. Michael's military career had ended prematurely due to his obsession with investigating submarine disappearances, leading to psychological counseling and early discharge. James Murphy's political activism had evolved into a career as a labor organizer, where his family's experience with military bureaucracy provided credibility with workers who distrusted government institutions. His speeches often included references to his brother's disappearance as evidence of institutional disregard for working-class families, though he rarely mentioned the ongoing emotional impact on his personal life. The development of more sophisticated underwater exploration technology during the 1960s and 1970s created new possibilities for resolving old mysteries, though few resources were dedicated to investigating World War II submarine losses. The discovery of several previously unknown shipwrecks during commercial and scientific deep-sea operations provided hope that the Harder's remains might eventually be located, but also demonstrated the vastness of unexplored ocean areas where evidence might remain hidden. Military historians during this period began recognizing the psychological and social impact of unresolved wartime disappearances, leading to academic studies that examined the USS Harder case among others. These scholarly investigations provided emotional validation for affected families while highlighting the inadequacy of 1940s search and recovery procedures. However, academic interest rarely translated into resources for active investigation of specific cases. The approach of the war's 40th anniversary in 1982 brought renewed media attention to unresolved military mysteries, including submarine disappearances. Television documentaries and magazine articles about the Harder generated temporary public interest, but no new evidence about the vessel's fate. For families still affected by the mystery, this media coverage provided both validation of their ongoing suffering and frustration with superficial treatment of their complex emotional reality. As the 1970s ended, most surviving family members had reached some form of accommodation with permanent uncertainty. The hope that had sustained them through the immediate post-war decades had transformed into something more complex, a commitment to memory that didn't require resolution, and an understanding that some questions would remain unanswered, regardless of technological advances or historical investigation. The 1980s and 1990s witnessed remarkable advances in underwater exploration technology that transformed the possibilities for locating and investigating sunken vessels from World War II. Deep-sea submersibles, side-scan sonar and satellite navigation systems made previously inaccessible ocean depths available for systematic search operations, raising hope among families of missing submarine crews that long-buried secrets might finally surface. Tommy Harrison, now a respected marine research scientist, found himself uniquely positioned to benefit from these technological developments. His academic credentials provided access to cutting-edge exploration equipment, while his personal motivation ensured that any research project would include systematic scanning of areas where the USS Harder might have met its fate. His official research into Pacific Ocean floor geology provided cover for more focused investigations into specific World War II submarine disappearance sites. The discovery of the USS Thresher in 1963 and subsequent location of other Cold War submarine accidents demonstrated that even vessels lost in deep water could be found and investigated with proper resources and technology. These successes provided both hope and frustration for families dealing with older mysteries, as they highlighted what might be possible while emphasizing the lack of official interest in resolving World War II cases. Tommy's collaboration with Robert Ballard's team, famous for locating the RMS Titanic, brought professional credibility to his search for his father's submarine. Ballard's interest in the USS Harder case was primarily historical, viewing it as part of a broader project to document and preserve underwater archaeological sites from the Second World War. However, he understood Tommy's personal investment and agreed to include the Tarawa area in his Pacific research schedule when funding and logistics permitted. The development of GPS navigation systems during the late 1980s revolutionized the precision with which search operations could be conducted. Earlier investigations had relied on dead reckoning and celestial navigation, making it nearly impossible to systematically cover large ocean areas or return to promising sites for follow-up investigation. The new technology allowed researchers to create detailed grids covering the entire area where the Harder might have gone down. Margaret Harrison, now in her 70s, had lived to see technology advance to the point where her husband's fate might realistically be determined. Her decades of correspondence with military historians and submarine veterans had created an extensive network of contacts who shared information about new discoveries and investigation techniques. Her filing cabinets full of theories and maps, once viewed as obsessive behavior, now represented valuable historical documentation that professional researchers consulted regularly. The end of the Cold War brought unexpected benefits for families seeking information about World War II submarine losses. Declassification of previously secret military documents revealed new details about wartime operations and intelligence reports that had been unavailable during the immediate post-war period. While most of this material didn't directly address individual submarine fates, it provided context that helped researchers understand the strategic and tactical situations that submarines like the Harder had faced. Catherine O'Brien, now approaching 70, had maintained her vigil for Patrick Murphy through 5 decades of technological and social change. The possibility that new underwater exploration techniques might finally provide answers about the submarine's fate created both hope and anxiety. After so many years of uncertainty, the prospect of definitive knowledge about Patrick's death seemed almost as frightening as continued ignorance. The Murphy family's 3rd generation had grown up with stories about their missing uncle, but without the emotional investment that had consumed their parents and grandparents. Patrick's nephew, Michael Murphy Jr., had become a successful engineer whose technical background allowed him to understand the new search technologies being developed. His more detached perspective on the family mystery led him to volunteer his expertise while maintaining emotional distance from the outcome. Li Wei Chen had died in 1987 at the age of 89, having maintained her son's shrine until the final weeks of her life. Her death marked the end of first-generation family members directly affected by the USS Harder's disappearance, leaving behind a community of descendants and researchers who carried forward the search for answers without the consuming personal anguish that had driven earlier generations. The Chinese-American community in Des Moines had established a scholarship fund in Robert Chen's memory, administered by the local veterans organization. This institutional recognition of his sacrifice provided some measure of official acknowledgement, that his family had sought for decades, though it came too late for his parents to witness. The scholarship recipients, young Chinese-American students pursuing careers in naval engineering and oceanography, represented a form of legacy that transcended the mystery of his disappearance. The development of commercial deep-sea exploration during the 1990s created new opportunities for investigating submarine wrecks, as companies like Odyssey Marine Exploration began systematically searching for historically significant shipwrecks in previously unexplored areas of the Pacific. Their business model, based on recovering valuable cargo from sunken merchant vessels, occasionally included pro bono historical research that benefited families seeking answers about military losses. Tommy Harrison's connection with these commercial exploration companies provided access to search technology and expertise that would have been prohibitively expensive for academic or personal research projects. His reputation as a marine scientist lent credibility to requests for investigation of specific sites, while his personal investment ensured thorough follow-through on any promising discoveries. Several companies agreed to include USS Harder search patterns in their broader Pacific exploration missions. The advent of Internet communication during the 1990s revolutionized the ability of submarine families and researchers to share information and coordinate search efforts. Online forums dedicated to World War II submarine losses connected people who had been working in isolation for decades, creating virtual communities that transcended geographical boundaries. Margaret Harrison's extensive correspondence network, maintained through letters for 50 years, suddenly expanded exponentially through email and message boards. These digital connections revealed that the USS Harder case was part of a much larger pattern of unresolved submarine disappearances from the Pacific theater. Families dealing with similar losses shared strategies for accessing military records, coordinating with professional researchers, and maintaining hope across multiple decades. The collective knowledge assembled through these networks often exceeded what individual military historians or official archives could provide. The discovery of several previously unknown World War II submarine wrecks during the 1990s demonstrated both the potential and the challenges of systematic underwater archaeology. Each successful location required extensive resources, sophisticated technology, and considerable luck in searching vast ocean areas. The USS Legato, found in 2005 in the Gulf of Thailand, and the USS Greyback, discovered in 2019 off Japan, proved that even submarines lost in deep water could be found and identified with sufficient effort and proper technology. However, these successes also highlighted the enormous scope of the remaining search challenges. The Pacific Ocean contained hundreds of unresolved submarine disappearances, each requiring individual investigation in areas where environmental conditions and seafloor geology complicated search operations. The Tarawa region, where the USS Harder had vanished, presented particular difficulties due to coral formations, varying depths, and strong currents that could scatter wreckage over large areas. Military historians during this period began acknowledging the broader social impact of unresolved wartime losses, recognizing that families like those affected by the USS Harder case represented a significant population whose experiences had been largely overlooked in official accounts of the war's aftermath. Academic conferences and scholarly publications began addressing the psychological and sociological dimensions of ambiguous loss, providing intellectual frameworks for understanding experiences that had previously been viewed as individual pathology rather than systemic phenomena. The approaching 60th anniversary of the submarine's disappearance in 2002 brought renewed media attention to the case, with several documentary filmmakers expressing interest in following the ongoing search efforts. This coverage helped generate funding and public support for continued investigation, while also creating pressure for rapid results that didn't align with the methodical pace required for deep-sea archaeology. The year 2024 began like any other for the remaining families connected to the USS Harder mystery, with routine correspondence between researchers and periodic updates about technological advances in underwater exploration. None of them could have anticipated that 82 years of questions would finally be answered by a combination of artificial intelligence analysis, advanced sonar mapping, and pure determination from a team that refused to abandon hope. Dr. Tommy Harrison, now in his 80s but still actively involved in marine research, had partnered with the Lost 52 Project, an organization dedicated to finding the 52 American submarines lost during World War II. The project's systematic approach to investigating each disappearance had already resulted in the discovery of 7 previously unknown wrecks, providing closure to families and valuable historical information to researchers worldwide. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source: machine learning analysis of declassified Japanese naval records that had been digitized during a cultural exchange program between American and Japanese maritime museums. AI algorithms trained to identify patterns in military communications discovered references to a submarine engagement near Tarawa that had never been properly translated or analyzed by human researchers. The Japanese records, written in technical naval terminology that had challenged human translators, described a coordinated depth charge attack on November 15, 1942, in the exact area where the USS Harder had last transmitted its position. The attack had involved 3 destroyers using a new pattern of explosive charges designed to damage submarines even at significant depths. Most importantly, the records indicated that debris had been observed floating to the surface, but rough seas had prevented recovery or detailed examination. This documentary evidence provided the first concrete confirmation that the USS Harder had indeed been destroyed by enemy action, validating decades of speculation while providing precise coordinates for underwater search operations. The Japanese records included detailed navigational information that, when converted to modern GPS coordinates, indicated a search area less than 5 square miles in extent. Dr. Harrison's team, working with the research vessel Petrel, began systematic sonar mapping of the indicated area in March 2024. The seafloor topography around Tarawa presented significant challenges, with coral formations and underwater canyons that could easily conceal wreckage from standard search techniques. The team employed side-scan sonar, multi-beam echo sounders, and remotely operated vehicles equipped with high-definition cameras to thoroughly investigate every anomalous reading. On April 18, 2024, sonar operators detected a large metallic object resting at a depth of 380 feet in an underwater canyon that had been carved by centuries of current action. The object's dimensions and configuration matched those of a Gato-class submarine, but positive identification required visual confirmation through underwater photography and careful examination of distinguishing features. The remotely operated vehicle's descent to the wreck site revealed a submarine that had been remarkably preserved by the deep, cold water and protective positioning within the canyon. The vessel lay upright on the seafloor, its hull cracked open amidships where depth charges had caused catastrophic damage. Despite the destruction, the submarine's conning tower remained intact, with hull numbers clearly visible to confirm its identity as USS SS-2557, the official designation for USS Harder. The discovery provided immediate answers to some questions while raising others. The submarine's position and condition confirmed that it had been destroyed quickly during the depth charge attack, meaning the crew would not have suffered prolonged agony. However, the wreck's location, nearly 2 miles from where the submarine had transmitted its final position report, suggested that Lieutenant Commander Harrison had been attempting evasive maneuvers when the attack occurred. Most significantly, the ROV's cameras revealed evidence that some crew members had attempted to escape the submarine after the initial damage. The forward torpedo room's escape hatch had been opened from the inside, and debris patterns suggested that several men had tried to reach the surface. This discovery meant that some of the Harder's crew had survived the initial attack, but had likely drowned during their desperate ascent from the damaged submarine. Personal effects visible within the wreck included waterlogged photographs, letters, and personal items that had belonged to individual crew members. The ROV's mechanical arm carefully recovered several items that could be identified and potentially returned to families, including a class ring engraved with R. Chen 1940 and a pocket watch that had belonged to Patrick Murphy. The formal announcement of the USS Harder's discovery was made on May 15, 2024, during a press conference attended by representatives from the Navy, the Lost 52 Project, and surviving family members. Margaret Harrison, now 92 and in failing health, attended the announcement in a wheelchair. her hand clutched around a faded photograph of her husband that she had carried for more than 8 decades. The confirmation that her husband and his crew had died fighting the enemy, rather than through accident or mechanical failure, provided a form of closure that Margaret had hardly dared to hope for during her long vigil. The knowledge that Samuel had been conducting evasive maneuvers during the attack suggested that he had been trying to save his crew and complete his mission even in the face of overwhelming enemy force. Catherine O'Brien, now 89, received the news about Patrick Murphy's recovered belongings while in a nursing home in Boston. Her response was characteristically quiet dignity, expressing gratitude that she had lived long enough to know that her decades of waiting had not been in vain. The pocket watch, when returned to her, still contained a photograph of Catherine that Patrick had carried throughout his naval service. The discovery generated international media attention, with documentary crews from multiple countries arriving at Tarawa to film the wreck site and interview family members. The story resonated with audiences worldwide as an example of persistence, love, and the importance of never abandoning hope for truth and justice, even after decades of uncertainty. The USS Harder wreck site was immediately designated as a war grave, with strict protocols established for any future archaeological work. The Navy announced plans for a formal memorial service to be conducted at sea above the submarine's final resting place, allowing families to finally say goodbye to their loved ones in the location where they had made their ultimate sacrifice for their country. The discovery of USS Harder in 2024 brought not just closure to families, but also sparked a broader conversation about the military's responsibility to resolve unresolved losses from past conflicts. The case became a symbol of how persistent advocacy, advancing technology, and international cooperation could finally provide answers that had been beyond reach for more than 8 decades. Dr. Tommy Harrison's role in the discovery provided a poignant conclusion to his lifelong search for his father. At 82 years old, he had spent more time looking for Lieutenant Commander Samuel Harrison than he had ever spent with him. The successful location of the submarine validated not just his scientific career, but also the childhood promise he had made to never stop searching for the truth about his father's disappearance. The Naval Memorial Service conducted above the USS Harder wreck site on June 15, 2024, drew more than 200 attendees, including family members, submarine veterans, Navy officials, and researchers who had contributed to the discovery. Margaret Harrison, despite her frail health, insisted on attending the ceremony and was assisted by Navy personnel in casting a wreath into the Pacific waters, where her husband had died fighting for his country. The service included the reading of all 79 names of the crew members who had perished with the submarine, many spoken aloud for the first time at a military ceremony. Each name represented not just an individual loss, but also the families who had endured decades of uncertainty while maintaining faith that the truth would eventually emerge. The ceremony acknowledged both their sacrifice and the institutional failures that had prolonged their suffering. Catherine O'Brien's attendance at the memorial, despite her advanced age and declining health, represented the completion of a journey that had begun with a young woman's promise to wait for her fiancé's return from war. Her presence at Patrick Murphy's final memorial service provided symbolic closure to one of the most enduring love stories to emerge from World War II. She died peacefully 3 months later, having finally received the answers she had sought for more than 80 years. The recovery of personal effects from the USS Harder created both opportunities and challenges for the Navy's Casualty Affairs Office. Items that could be positively identified were returned to families through formal ceremonies that acknowledged the long wait they had endured. However, many artifacts required extensive research to determine their original owners, creating new connections between historians and descendants who had never been formally recognized as military families. Robert Chen's class ring, recovered from the submarine's interior, was presented to his nephew's family during a ceremony at the Chinese-American Museum in Los Angeles. The event highlighted the particular challenges faced by immigrant families dealing with military losses while celebrating the integration and sacrifice that defined the World War II generation's experience. The museum established a permanent exhibit about Chinese Americans in military service, with Chen's story as a centerpiece. The discovery also resolved long-standing questions about the effectiveness of Japanese anti-submarine warfare during the Pacific Campaign. The detailed analysis of damage to the USS Harder confirmed that enemy forces had indeed developed sophisticated depth-charge tactics that proved devastatingly effective against American submarines operating in shallow waters around fortified positions like Tarawa. Military historians use the wreck site as a case study for improving current search and recovery operations for missing service members. The techniques developed during the USS Harder investigation were immediately applied to other unresolved submarine disappearances, leading to the discovery of 2 additional World War II vessels within the following year. The success created momentum for expanded funding of similar historical recovery projects. The international cooperation that enabled the discovery, particularly the sharing of Japanese naval records, established new protocols for collaborative historical research between former wartime enemies. The project demonstrated how shared commitment to honoring military sacrifice could transcend national boundaries and historical animosities, creating frameworks for future cooperation on similar investigations. The Lost 52 project used the USS Harder discovery to advocate for increased resources for locating the remaining 44 American submarines still missing from World War II. The project's success in providing closure to families after 8 decades of uncertainty highlighted the importance of never abandoning efforts to account for missing service members, regardless of how much time had passed since their disappearance. Dr. Harrison's final interview, conducted 3 months after the discovery, reflected on the personal cost of his lifelong search and the mixed emotions that came with finally achieving his goal. While grateful for the answers that had finally emerged, he acknowledged that no discovery could truly compensate for the childhood that had been overshadowed by mystery and loss. His experience became part of academic studies, examining how unresolved trauma affects subsequent generations. The USS Harder case also influenced contemporary military policies regarding family notification and support during active conflicts. The decades of suffering endured by submarine families highlighted the importance of maintaining hope while providing realistic assessments of missing personnel situations. Current protocols emphasize transparency and regular communication to prevent the institutional neglect that had characterized the World War II era. The submarine's discovery coincided with broader national conversations about honoring military sacrifice and supporting veterans' families. The story resonated with contemporary military families dealing with deployments and casualties from recent conflicts, providing both inspiration and cautionary examples about the long-term impact of wartime service on multiple generations. The wreck site continues to serve as an active archaeological location, with researchers using non-intrusive techniques to document the submarine's condition and recover additional historical artifacts. Each discovery provides new insights into the final moments of the USS Harder's crew, while maintaining the site's dignity as a war grave and memorial to their sacrifice. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Lieutenant Commander Samuel Harrison and the crew of USS Harder. See you in the next video.